what types of coalition government will form after the May 29th vote, and how will that impact economic policy, labor, growth, fixed investment, things that's very relevant for ordinary South Africans, for businesses and investors, which is something we'll also get into here. That is why their support in those areas has dipped to 30%. They've completely lost the urban vote because they've failed those people. They've failed primarily the youth, which now the youth unemployment rate sits at about close to 70%, which is absolutely astounding.
Welcome to the State of the Nation. As we look forward to the general elections, our world was rocked on its axis recently when we had a look at some polling data showing the ANC well under 40%, and that was before the real emergence of Mkhonto Wesizwe and the victory to have ex-former President Jacob Zuma appear on the ballot paper. That was done by the Social Research Foundation, that poll. And joining us today is Bheki Mahlobo, who's a partner at Frans Cronje's business, Frans Cronje Private Clients. Frans Cronje is known to many of the people that watch State of the Nation as a person we love to get in here with, and he's a great analyst of the political scene. You're working with him. You're also part of the Social Research Foundation. Mm-hmm. So, but you obviously have a heavy slant towards the economic side of the analysis. Tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Mike, thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I look forward to the conversation we'll have. A little bit about myself. Yes, I'm slanted towards the economics, the socioeconomic indicators, the like. And really the reason why I'm slanted behind that is because I really would like to understand socioeconomic conditions in the country and how South Africa compares to the rest of the world. When I started my career earlier on under France as well, about 5 years ago, the question that was posed to me is, why do we see ANC voter support decline, or declining at that time? That time the ANC was still around that 60% level. But if you were to look at socioeconomic indicators, you see that there's two periods in South Africa's history. You have when the country enters democracy in 1994, under the early administration of the ANC, Nelson Mandela and Thabo Mbeki. When you look at metrics such as employment, we doubled the number of people that had jobs. When you're looking at indicators such as households without electricity, the proportion declined from about 50% down to where it currently is, below 20%. And I grew up in rural parts of the country, in Eastern Cape, in which we, in my childhood years, didn't have access to electricity. And in fact, for us to have warm food at night, we needed to make fire for that. And I saw that early success of the ANC, where it was actually delivering on jobs and was delivering on service delivery. And that culminated in ANC voter support reaching the highest it ever been in 2004 under Thabo Mbeki, near 70%. After that period, we had 10 years of economic stagnation, state capture, load shedding after load shedding, living conditions declining to the point where they haven't even recovered to 2019 levels if you look at GDP per capita. And the result of that is what we see in the polls currently, where the ANC is sitting near 40%, or the latest poll from the foundation at 37%. So the support of the ANC hinges on the lived experiences of South Africans. And currently that's not looking too good, resulting in ANC voter support not looking good going into these elections.
Yeah, because I suppose you can only for so long tell people that they should be grateful that they got electrified back then, and you should give us your vote forevermore. Life doesn't work that way, right?
Exactly. If you also look at jobs, for example, been stagnant for the past 10 years. We should have been growing at the same level what we saw in 1994 until 2008, where the country was matching what we saw in emerging markets as well as the global average. We were increasing our economy, the size of our economy. Fixed investment was also increasing, particularly also amongst the private sector, and there were jobs and people were getting jobs. Particularly also if you look at black employment, which also nearly doubled, as well as black labor participation, in fact, across all races, because there was opportunity in the country, leading to a rise in the number of people employed. And unfortunately, we're not seeing that currently, which is also going to be quite important in the next 10 years in the country.
Yeah, and I suppose we've seen that manifest in many of the policies of the parties. across the spectrum, where it's almost like economics is a dirty word. You've got to keep on talking about how much more you're going to give to people who aren't productive, as opposed to what you're going to do for people who are productive, and how you're going to grow that net.
Yeah, exactly. So in this question or this theme, really, it's about like really the social grants, right? Currently, we have
not
only the social grants, but
because it's a social grant, and social engineering,
yes,
right? Of saying because of this policy, we're not going to grow the economy; it's just going to change the complexion.
Yeah,
but it doesn't actually make one more rand for the country.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't improve the economy itself, and instead you have a situation where the economy struggles to surpass 2%, where jobs stagnate, which we've touched on. And you have a large proportion of South Africans relying on social grants. I think now it's about 50% of South Africans that rely on a social grant in some way or form. While the number of people employed sits at about 16.7 million compared to about 30 odd million South Africans that are on social grants. So that is a wide gap because the economy is not growing. Yes. And you have a lot of people that rely on that social grants. But the alternative, if you say that, and I'm not saying this comes from you particularly, when we have this pressing issue where you have a large pool of people that don't have a job, that rely on social grants, the answer to that is that you cut social grants. But how do you cut social grants in an economy that has been growing for the past 10 years? You're pushing millions of South Africans to poverty. And I agree with you. The answer to that is that you grow the economy so that you get more people employed. And South Africans want jobs. They would love a job as it gives them dignity and the ability for them to earn an income to sustain their families.
Yeah, look, the dignity point is well made. It does keep, there is the dignity of having a job. There's also, in all likelihood, you're going to earn a lot more than 350 Rand a month or 370 Rand, whatever it's been increased.
Yes.
So it's not just about the dignity. I mean, I'd be quite happy to stay in bed most of the day, but I couldn't survive on 350 Rand a month. And therefore, I must wake up and do whatever it is that I can do to earn a multiple of that, which, I think gets lost in this conversation. But sure. Yeah, we have the same thing sort of on a political basis where everybody doesn't talk about they'll go to the squatter areas and tell you what they're going to do about that, but they won't tell you about what they're going to do for the cities.
Yeah,
or the industry that we so desperately need. Yeah, I find that quite fascinating, and obviously we are now seeing a plethora of parties emerge on both sides of the aisle. Right, we've seen a lot of parties. I love the fact that we kind of get it the wrong way around. We call MK, EFF left wing when they're actually very right wing. They're very conservative. They're very old fashioned. They don't believe in liberalism. That's your traditional, more conservative line, as opposed to people that want private ownership, free markets, etc. So let's just quickly discuss those polls for the people that haven't seen them, and then we can go on to some scenarios that you have produced. So if we start off with a poll, the headline was there was obviously a steeper decline in the ANC down to 37%.
Yes.
An increase in the Democratic Alliance to 25%.
Yes, that is correct. Yes,
and under the poll, and as I said, not quite in its recent fullest form, because I think what people have to understand. You can tell us a little bit more about polling, but polling is almost like a temperature check that might change next week.
Exactly, quite drastically.
And ever since that poll came out, something did change fundamentally, and that is that the Mkhonto weSizwe party got the IEC to agree with it that. Former President Jacob Zuma is eligible to stand, and that's got a potential to really shift the election.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, most certainly. I mean, if you look at the years between 2022 and 2023, the ANC was polling at near 50%. It was roughly in the ranges of 45 to 49%. And it's chiefly the introduction of the MK party, which has dragged that party support levels to near 40%. And if you look at polling as well in that year, in between those years, you had about a third of ANC voters that said they were open to another political party to vote for that party, in which other parties were not able to capitalize on that, while the MK party, the introduction of the MK party, did capitalize on that, and the surge in that party translated in voter support for the ANC to also decline. But what is also interesting in the latest polls that has come out is that the president of the ANC, Cyril Ramaphosa, as well as for that of the nation, his favorability has massively declined from about 60% favorability amongst all voters to where it currently stands at about 30%, which also explains the decline in ANC voter support currently. So you have the surge in MK party, as well as the favorability of its president, the ANC, declining as well, resulting in the polling levels that we currently have. And I think what is important with these polls, yes, they are the temperature and they can shift quite drastically, but the result is becoming clearer and clearer. And as we come 6 weeks before the elections, the foundation, the Social Research Foundation, will be running a daily poll that tries to get towards the accurate answer as to what will be the final results of the elections. But I think what will be more important is what will these politicians do with those results? What types of coalition governments will form after the May 29th vote, and how will that impact economic policy, labor, growth, fixed investment, things that's very relevant for ordinary South Africans, for businesses and investors, which is something we'll also get into here.
So you have produced some scenarios that are applicable at the moment and worth considering. So we're going to get this up on screen, and let's talk about the first scenario, and that is the one where that shouldn't be discounted, and that is the potential for the ANC to rally to the point that it gets 50%.
Yeah.
50% plus one, maybe 50% even with some of the entrepreneurial parties, you know, Patricia de Lille,
yes,
Bantu Alamisa. These are people that always give their vote to the ANC. Tell us what that scenario looks like.
Yeah, so before we go in, we touch on these scenarios just a little bit. You laid out quite well where these political parties stand. You have the ANC at 40%, and this takes polling from other polling groups as well. If you average those polling groups for the past 36 months, the ANC sits near 40%, the DA sitting about 25%, the EFF is close to 10%, and the MK party is at about 10%. The Moonshot Pack, which is a coalition of opposition parties, is sub 40%, including that with that of the DA. And if you look at the three most contested provinces, such as Gauteng, such as the Western Cape, as well as KwaZulu-Natal, which are responsible for about 50% of national GDP, I think what happens in those provinces will also determine the type of government we will get after the May elections. In Gauteng, you have the ANC sitting about 30%. The DA is not that far behind it. What's interesting in the Western Cape actually is that the DA's majority in the Western Cape is narrowing. It's flirting with a margin of error of actually losing that province. In KZN, you have about 4 parties that are set about 20%. That is the ANC, the DA, the IFP, and the MK party, which is clawing its way towards 30%. And that is just the political layout that the viewers should also keep in mind when it goes towards these coalition scenarios. And the first result is that, let's say, for example, if the MK party loses the political momentum it has gained over the past few months. And the question we often get is, why is the MK party surging so much? Why is it that we have Jacob Zuma, who is seen at the helm of state capture and the like? How is he getting so much support? And when I get this question, I often need to remind viewers that South Africa is a African emerging market. It's not necessarily a Western emerging market, that the likes that you see in Europe or that of North America, even South America for that matter. And the man is well positioned to gain political momentum. He's seen as a man who has been exiled by his own party. Remember, this is a person that gained a lot of support when he became president after Thabo Mbeki. His voters see that he's been completely removed, abandoned by his own party, and scapegoated by his party, leading to the surge that we currently see under the MK party. In the first scenario, let's say we have the elections. Let's say if the MK party loses its momentum, you could have the ANC poll at the same levels it did between 2022 and 2023, where it comes close to about 50% and even surges on the day of elections as it gets more people on the ground. So I'll ask there if Matthew could please pull up the first
Yeah.
3 points there. The first one is ANC at nearly 50%. The second one is ANC above 50%. The third one, which is quite interesting, is ANC near 40%. And just to explain these three pillars again, the ANC at nearly 50%, this is when the MK's party momentum falls away, and the ANC manages to surge about 40% in Gauteng as well as KZN. At 50%, again, the MK party loses momentum and the ANC is able to gain a majority to rule the nation for the next 5 years. ANC near 40%, this is when, unfortunately, the party now is in crisis. It's unable to gain majority. The MK's party momentum rallies quite strongly, as well as that of the performance of the DA. And in the first scenario, what may happen here is that you have the the ANC polling at about 49% or that of 45%. Here, it needs a coalition of small parties it can attract, such as that of the Good Party, the Patriotic Alliance, in order for it to gain majority and govern. You can even make a deal with the IFP. In order for it to make a deal with the IFP, this would be the ANC at about 45%. And the difference between ANC at 45% 49%, it's not really that much difference. If the ANC polls lower, therefore it means it needs to make a bigger deal with other opposition parties. With the MK can assist the ANC in having a majority in KZN, as the IFP polls at about 20% in KZN, and can therefore, with this deal, say, okay, IFP, you can govern KZN and therefore join us in the national vote in order for us to govern with majority. In terms of the stuff that matters, the bread and butter stuff, what happens to economic policy, it is the status quo in this regard. You see GDP growth being capped at about 2%, nothing in the main changes in terms of public policy, and it's much of what we're seeing currently. And in terms of the second scenario, in which the ANC is polling near 50%, this is the second pillar. Here you have the ANC that is at a majority. And should this result actually surprise media, analysts, and the like, Cyril Ramaphosa may stay the leader of the party. And in this regard, you might see an initial surge in sentiment. This would be seen as a stable result. That's why you'd see an initial result. Initial surge in sentiment, investor sentiment particularly. But when it comes to policy, nothing really changes because the ANC, the party itself, does not have the appetite to actually implement fundamental reforms in the country. Therefore, it is much of the same even in this scenario when it comes to actual bread and butter issues for ordinary South Africans. Nothing changes. The third scenario, this is the party in crisis. This is the ANC that has a landslide loss in Gauteng as well as that in KwaZulu-Natal. And it has lost these provinces and risks of it being a party based in rural heartland in the country. And in this case, it needs to turn a negative into a positive. An ANC supported 40% is a failure for this party. And the risk is that Cyril might actually leave the party, dragging ANC's voter support even worse than what it currently is. Therefore, cabinet officials cannot have this result, and they know that they need Cyril in order for them to govern. Otherwise, the man, he does also protect the party itself. And they need to sell the story to South Africans, as well as Cyril himself. They need to say that this is a historical moment for the country, and we need to, all of us, work together in order for us to achieve a common goal. In this scenario, it could even be Cyril Ramaphosa that calls a national convention, in which through this, a government of national unity will be established. It means parties such as Action SA, the DA, the Good Party will be invited to form a unity government. And as this, all parties will lose their distinguishing characteristics. The DA loses its colors, as well as that of the Patriotic Alliance and Action SA and the like, and they form one party that has a common goal. On the surface of this might actually be favorable for business or South Africans, as they see that this is all parties coming together and working together. And the thinking behind this, and let's take the assumption, just think a way through this. Let's take the assumption that this unity government is open to fundamental reform. While you could have such things such as the expropriation without compensation, the national health insurance being scrapped or forestalled, you could have mining policy improve, port and railroad networks start to improve, and GDP to rise from about 1.5% to 3%. So if this is the party, as well as particularly the ANC, is welcoming to reforms, then you could have these socio-economic indicators improve as well as the broader economy improve. However, there is a risk with this. And I think the DA is also quite well aware of it. If the ANC, as it currently stands, is fundamentally opposed to fundamental reforms in the country, it could use this, the government of national unity, as an opportunity to undermine other political parties, in which it invites all parties to this unity government and makes these parties complicit to its maladministration, to the corruption. It's no longer the DA is known for best service delivery. We are all in one under this unity government. Therefore, any achievement or failure is attributed to everyone. For the voters, it'll be quite concerning. It is the concern that we saw in municipalities after the 2021 elections, where these parties were infighting against each other. This would largely be the same thing, where now the DA would be seen as complicit in ANC corruption, and they would lose a lot of support from their own voters. This is a risk for the DA. Therefore, it won't be necessarily welcoming to this thought, given that risk. But at the same time, it can't say no. Because if it says no, then Cyril or that of the ANC could say that we went to the DA to form a coalition in order for the country to succeed in the next election cycle. And the DA simply refused. Therefore, the DA forced our hands to an EFF coalition. And unfortunately, the economic consequences of that will be attributed to the hands of the DA. Therefore, the DA can't say no to this deal, nor can it say yes fully. And sort of the middle ground between the two extremes could be what's called a support and a confidence and support agreement, where you have an ANC minority government. You do have minority governments around the world as well, if you look at for the likes of Germany, where an ANC minority government is anchored by the consortiumship of a centrist party. And this in exchange for the centrist party, such as that of the DA, having chairmanship of key roles such as parliamentary oversight committees. The ANC benefits in this regard, in which it does not need to go in coalition with the EFF, which will hollow it out and will need to give away its assets, give away its patronage networks to the EFF, as well as prevent the risk of it being a rural party, as it would have lost Gauteng as well as KZN, and now being a party centered in the northern parts of the country. I think better strategists within the ANC want to prevent that risk. So the ANC benefits with this agreement. In terms of what the DA benefits with this agreement, while it says we're not in a formal coalition with the ANC, therefore we will not be complicit in any forms of corruption. In fact, we will have oversight if there's a minister within ESCOM, let's say, for example, stealing funds and the like, or the railroad network is not working properly. They can bring those officials to account if they want. And they also get the benefit of keeping their colors and being a party known for service delivery and the like. And a point that voters as well should understand, and business should also understand, is that these two parties are not gunning for the same voter. If you look at the voters for the DA, these are urban dwellers, multiracial individuals that vote for the party, whereas the ANC's voter base is primarily in rural areas that also wants to target aspiring black middle income class earners. And therefore, they're not gunning for the same voter, meaning there won't be that much infighting between parties. I think the chaos that we saw after the local elections was that you had a lot of parties that shared common values, which is quite attributable, and it is nice. But the issue that they face is that they were gunning for the same voter. And I think that's what caused a lot of the political infighting, which a lot of South Africans don't like. So therefore, this deal of a confidence and support agreement works on its face value. And the consequences of that in terms of economic policy is that you could see a modest improvement in economic policy, where you would have, for example, an increased buffer of accountability. And you could see the currency also improve in this situation, should it improve, and should this, because the relationship between the ANC having a minority government, as well as the DA backing up that government by vetoing any motions of no confidence, as well as aiding in passing the national budget. If you have a minority government, you're quite vulnerable to motions of no confidence that could collapse a government and send the rand flying towards 30 rand to the dollar. In this agreement, political stability could be achieved, as well as that of the policies that could come after it. The most feared consequence of the ANC at 40% is where it now does a deal with the EFF. In this particular regard, in terms of economic policy, this is the worst outcome that can happen, because you would see an acceleration of expropriation without compensation, as well as that of the national health insurance. If you look at the fundamental thing that actually matters, the ideology, the way of thinking between these two parties, there's not that much difference. These parties would like expropriation without compensation, as well as that of the NHI, which would see the rand dramatically depreciate towards the dollar, reaching perhaps even 100 rands to $1. Seeing the same pattern which we saw in Argentina in August 2019, as well as what's currently happening in Nigeria currently, where its currency has lost over 100% of its value, as well as that of the country now moving away from being a free and open society, coming towards the 2029 elections. That's by far the worst scenario that might happen after these elections.
Yeah, well, a lot of food for thought. The one question that sort of comes up is, in the case of the last scenario, where the ANC enters into a coalition, be it with the EFF or with the Mkhonto weSizwe party,
Yes.
they would really need to roll back the freedoms because, elections follow, and South Africans have become accustomed to their freedoms. I don't think South Africans really appreciate how accustomed to our freedom we have become.
Yeah, I think it's something that's heavily underappreciated. The fact that you could be, let's say, on the public streets, you could be on Twitter, and you could swear at your national government and not be jailed. Yes. That is a barometer of a free and open society. And South Africa entered democracy so that we can vote out a party that's not meeting our needs of improving living conditions in the country. And I think that's one of the positives I would actually like to highlight about the country, is that we are a free and open society in which we can freely express our opinion. Not only that, but if you look at, for example, what's happened in northern parts of Africa, the continent, as well as in other countries, the alternative of that, of having a transition of power, is that of a violent revolution. I don't think that's the case with South Africa currently. We can freely express our opinions. Yes, we do have problems of protesting, where 30% of all protest action is violent. However, if you look at the way in which people express their opinion, they're still very much expressive of their opinion on social medias and the like, and on the public street, as well as that of voting, seen with the ANC voter support declining. That's one of the positives of South Africa, I would say, and one of the best cards that we have, that we can peacefully transition to a new type of government in the next coming years.
Yeah, well, we recently spoke to the spokesman for Mkhonto weSizwe party.
Yeah.
He seems to be quite adamant that they're not only going to win the election, to get 2/3 of the vote, right? Which I think would be a hell of a thing. That would mean that they seem to be stuck with the sort of vision of what happened in 2004, thinking that everybody was that they could get those kind of numbers again. But I suppose there is a chance, if one looks at ANC getting, let's say, 40% and EFF getting 15%, and that puts them up to 55%.
Yeah.
And MK gets 12%. There you've got a 2/3 majority.
Yeah.
It's not beyond the realms of possibility, but it seems to be highly unlikely, because there's a massive amount of cannibalism there, isn't there? They're not going to reinvent voters.
And I think when you look at these parties, you have to look at what do they want and what do they don't want. And when it comes to these types of coalitions, if you look at the MK party, yes, its party support is indeed surging. And I think a lot of that will become clear towards the elections and will largely settle as well.
Yeah.
So it remains to be seen whether it's capped at about 13%, or if it will indeed surge to about 20% odd, which it currently polls in KZN currently.
Yeah, but obviously KZN is a vital part of the world, and quite with one of the higher populations, but it's not the only province. And I'm seeing tremendous parallels, and I don't know if you've, I mean, you're a numbers guy, but certainly on the publicity and interest front, it feels to me like we're reliving the Cope phenomenon all over again in the build-up to the 2009 elections. And that was where Cope and the breakaway post-Polokwane in 2007, so Cope sort of comes around in 2008. And it was, the sort of idea being that this was going to be the new vehicle for Thabo Mbeki, and that was dominated the news dramatically. And then, got, 7% at the polls, even though it had dominated the news. It's starting to look like, the parallels are quite striking. However, Nkonto Wesizwe does have the figurehead in Jacob Zuma, who remains charismatic and popular.
Yes.
In a field of really bland candidates, one would have thought. Policies are one thing, but my Lord, man, some of those candidates, you have to wonder if people were concentrating when they put them in charge.
Yeah, I think the big question mark, particularly also with the ANC, came with what are we going to do with KZN? The ANC was losing support quite dramatically, and they didn't have a strong Zulu leader in KZN in order for their support levels to be supported near 50. Jacob Zuma's exit from the party and the introduction of the MK party is sort of an answer to that, which has led to the ANC dipping its support where it currently is right now and the MK party forming. However, there is a risk within the MK party in which Jacob Zuma is quite old right now. And the question is, will the MK party maintain those levels in these elections coming into the next elections as well? And if, let's say, there is no Jacob Zuma, who will replace him? And I think the Zulu nationalism is quite a real thing in South Africa, particularly around KZN, in which they want a strong Zulu leader to represent them in their national government as well as in the provincial government, to which that answer to them appears to be that of KZN or even that of the IFP, where it's also polling close to 20%. The question still remains as to whether the MK party will be able to maintain that momentum. I'm not sure what the answer is to that. That's why we drew it along coalition scenarios. But they are facing a risk in which that leader, Jacob Zuma, is quite old at the moment, and remains a question as to is there a strong leader amongst the MK leaders to overtake him?
Now, Bheki, you obviously watch these things pretty closely. One can't help but to be struck by the lackluster campaign that the ANC seems to be running at this stage. And, as we count down towards the election, which is now weeks away, we always hear about their tremendously well-oiled electoral machine. But it seems like the machinery may be well-oiled, but it may have run out of fuel. What do you ascribe this to, the fact that we're seeing hardly any ANC election posters?
Yeah.
There seems to be almost no ANC electioneering, and they are really leaving it late here.
They're really leaving it late. And the slogan, I believe, for the ANC now is working together. I think that's the political slogan of the ANC currently. And the lack of political posters, as well as the president's State of the Nation address, actually a few months ago, is quite telling, in which he created a fictional character explaining the history of the country. I think they don't have much to say currently. If you look at the matrix, their performance in terms of education, their performance in terms of jobs, their performance in terms of growth and investment, it's been all bad across all those factors. They've done quite badly at governance, and they've done quite badly at meeting the aspirations of millions of South Africans, particularly ones that want to live in urban areas. That is why their support in those areas has dipped to 30%. They've completely lost the urban vote because they've failed those people. They've failed primarily the youth, which now the youth unemployment rate sits at about close to 70%, which is absolutely astounding and should not be accepted in a country such as South Africa. So I think that's why they don't have a good story to tell anymore. And if we can just simply look at the distinction of the early ANC, in which they did have a story, and the story was a better life for all. in which they did, as we've earlier spoken about, they did deliver on service delivery. They delivered on formal housing. They delivered on jobs. They delivered on investment. Not only that, but they delivered also on the fiscus, in the point where we've reached in 100-year, if you look at this chart as well, in South Africa's 100-year history, there's only been one period in which the country reached a budget surplus and debt levels being halved. That was a period between 2004 and 2007 under the leadership of Thabo Mbeki. That has never been achieved in South Africa's 100-year history. And it also speaks to the story in which they were delivering on growth, they were delivering on jobs, and they were also delivering on the fiscus. That is not the ANC that we currently have at the moment. Therefore, they do not have a story to tell. Reason being why the president is creating a fictional character to tell his story, because he has nothing of substance looking at the objective data currently.
Yeah, and for any of the people watching us today that lived through 2007, when we did have growth rates of 5%, and then the ruling party decided to change direction completely in a country that's growing and unemployment falling, and deciding to sort of push ahead with Jacob Zuma, it kind of shows you that those particular delegates had something else in mind, and we I suppose we saw that at the Zondo Commission.
Exactly.
I'd just like to ask, if in your research, if the bad examples, the bad experience of governance within some of the prominent metros plays a role in people's electoral choices.
Most certainly it does.
If that is the case, right, I'll lump it all together so that you can answer it all together. If that is going to play a case that people's lived experience in Johannesburg and Gqeberha and Tshwane and Kuruleni and all these places is so horrific, the question is, who's it going to hurt the most? Because there were two parties, two sides of this argument, right? You had call it DA-led coalition that fell apart, and the infighting was terrible, right? On this channel, we couldn't have any of the opposition parties here without them talking so badly about that coalition experience. And then, of course, that ceded control over to the ANC-EFF coalition, which has proven to be, well, from a service delivery, nil, and the corruption through the roof. Who does this hurt the most?
Unfortunately, it hurts the constituencies in those metropolitan areas. And if you're asking me in terms of what is the solution to that, I think the solution would be a coalition government that will be able to meet those needs. And a solution in which you don't have these political parties fighting against each other and losing the larger objective, which is improving service delivery, which is improving the economy. I think even in those coalition scenarios, if the ANC and DA could find a way in which they both benefit in these agreements and can both govern the country, give it a few more years in which this relationship could indeed work, I would even be dared to say that this could be seen as a form of a marriage, perhaps, even. Where even if it does not necessarily need to be that of the ANC and DA, it could be the ANC and DA as well as other political organizations.
Could be the ANC and the multi-party charter.
Exactly, could be the ANC and the multi-party charter. But so long as these parties have, as well, are not gunning for the same voter, therefore also not having infighting amongst each other, and can actually meet the needs of the constituencies as well as broader South Africans in general, I think that could be the solution for South Africa for the next 5 to 10 years. And in fact, I would say I'm much more optimistic of the country in the next 10 years than I was in the previous 10 years. If you look at, for example, such matrix where the most pressing issues are prevalent, look at like electricity, for example, where we're seeing more and high intensity load shedding, you're seeing the private sector plug in. In fact, if you were to look at electricity production of Eskom, you're seeing a gap between what Eskom is producing as well as what South Africa is producing. And that gap between the two is where the private sector is now plugging in the gap left by the state. This is not only true of electricity, this is true of infrastructure in the country, for example, where you're seeing the stagnation of railway networks in the country. And what do you see on the roads? You're seeing more trucks on the road. You're seeing more goods being moved away from rail and towards vehicles on the road. You're seeing private sector plugging in the gaps left by the state. as well as that in policing. For every 450 South Africans, there's one police officer. In the private sector, it's about 100 for every one private police officer or private security officer. And this is not only true for wealthy nations or affluent nations, areas, I mean. This is also true for black areas as well. I grew up in Katlehong in the East Rand, and what I'm seeing is community watchdogs actually rising, where people are now taking on the responsibilities that were left by the state and upon themselves. And I think that is the South Africa that will emerge after these elections. And I think that's what actually is playing out currently, where you have people that have different needs and are taking on basic services that used to be done by the state but are now done in local communities. I think that's the South Africa for the next 10 years, which would lead to South Africa being one of the most interesting emerging markets in the next coming decade.
Now, obviously, we said polls are a temperature check, and we
Yes.
should expect a few more in the run-up to the elections. Are you going to be, is the Social Research Foundation going to be putting out more polling before
Yes.
the election?
Yeah, most definitely. The Social Research Foundation, in the 6 weeks to the elections, coming from this Wednesday, in fact, all the way until the election date, will be running a daily poll across all provinces, demographically representative and the like. A daily poll that tracks how these political parties, voter support for these political parties stand in each day, which will be freely available and for people to track.
Where do we find it?
You can find it on the website, on the Social Research Foundation website. That will be published as well.
Well, this has been fascinating. Bheki Mahlobo from France Cronier Private Clients and Social Research Foundation. It's been wonderful to speak to you. Talking about the private sector, support our sponsors, Pace Car Rental, where you can get a car in just about every city in South Africa, Johannesburg, Cape Town, Pretoria, Gqeberha. They are everywhere. So use Pace Car Rental. To Bheki Mahlobo, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk to us. We'll keep tabs on each other and hopefully get you back here as we get closer to the election. Thank you so much for your contribution today.
Mike, thank you so much.
And to everybody that joined us, thank you so much, and we'll see you the next time on The State of the Nation.